to a certain extent, it was a lot of the work that occurred in Kenya during the years between '08 and 2013 that meant that we didn't have to worry about that kind of violence the second time around. There was a lot of aggressive work by the international community, whether at the donor level or at the international court level, to try to begin to hold people responsible, to create some structural change about the way Kenya's laws and government worked. That meant that the political alignments that occurred during 2012 and 2013 changed in such a way that the violence was potentially avoided. The reason why we were able to avoid violence is because of a lot of these structural issues and changes, which took sort of years of investment and years of work. We ended up with sort of a rush of sort of people coming in the last 6 months to a year before the 2012 elections in 2013, but I don't really think that made a whole lot of difference in the kind of violence that we ended up with. What was at least as important to us within aid or within OTI and being able to do these things was that we had, especially for some of the most important periods in this, very, very tight and protective support from our ambassador and kind of the political side of things that was worried about these things. We were able to get quite a bit of space for, I think, taking what most people would sort of see were sort of fairly big risks, and doing some things that were, to a certain extent, out of the norm.
One of the things that happened as a result of that strategy is that we made democracy and governance, and we didn't use the word conflict resolution, but we made democracy and governance the centerpiece of our strategy, and trying to get the various parties working together on issues and giving them tools to do so, the core of our strategy. Population growth management and jobs and employment were the two wings on the three-pillared strategy. What was fascinating in that effort, though, which we were obviously very comfortable with, is that when we got to Washington, and afterwards, Washington said okay to the strategy, but the first thing they did was not give us any money to implement the centerpiece of the strategy, and then they went further and said, there's such a shortage of DG money, you're not a priority country for us. So we had to beg, borrow, and steal and be a little bit mischievous to try to do some of the things we were trying to do. But here you had an example of an analysis, an agreement on a strategy, but because of the types of money that Washington had available and the other pressures they were under, and Rwanda being a small country that was not high on the priority list, we did not get the resources that people agreed we should be getting to address the centerpiece of the strategy we thought would be a response to the wave of issues that we were grappling with. So that's, I think, to me, there are a couple of interesting things there. One is the doing the conflict vulnerability type assessment, and two is the disconnect that can happen, in spite of the fact that you do that, between what you see as a situation and the politics of Washington. I did not have a handle on, if you will, or a headset to help me process and think of conflict different from atrocities, different from something else. And from that type of understanding, kind of getting a sense of what that really means. And then what we might be able to do about it. Maybe not much, but how we might think differently, how we might prepare differently beyond the obvious.
I remember that she was hearing reporting from NGOs in the field that there had been an attack on a village by Mini-Malawi's forces, and that there were huge civilian deaths. Of course, the reporting wasn't great because this is just NGOs hearing things, a lot of humanitarian actors, and we typically don't document these things. So we're like, oh, we heard, we saw, whatever, but don't necessarily have all the details to say make a legal case that you would want. But still, she was hearing this. At the same time, Mini-Malawi was due in the US and was going to have some high-level meetings with the State Department. And I know that those concerns about this, what had done by his group, did actually make it via OFTA into talking points, or at least briefers, in preparation for his visit. I'd say that was a triumph of information sharing. I wasn't in the meetings to know the outcome, whether they actually were raised, how they were raised, if it actually rectified anything. But I think that was an important role that Opta played in relaying that information of just, hey, State Department, you should know that we're hearing this out in the field. Where we ran into challenges were, so at the end of my TDY, an assessment, very typical, everybody does this, wrote my assessment report, which was internal, and then turned that assessment report into a cable. The interesting point is that that cable never got cleared by the embassy. It was too alarmist, it raised too many problems. It wasn't the messaging that the embassy wanted to be sharing back with Washington about what was happening in Khartoum. And so it never got cleared on a various sort of nitpicky details, not inaccuracies, but really it was overall tone. I mean, I don't think anyone came out and said that, but that was certainly the underlying reason. That's a disappointment that such an important issue wasn't taken up.
When we're sending signals from the field that things are getting worse and humanitarian assistance is needed, we were actually getting messages too, through informal channels, of we've heard you, now you need to stop. So and we continue to put these out. I mean, we said this is our responsibility is to report things as they are, not as things people want them to be. But you know, I'm just envisioning the mass atrocity situations. It's even more politically sensitive if you start saying, I think mass atrocities are just around the corner based on, you know, X, Y, and Z. I'd say we're not really trained to, we're not looking for that, and we're not trained to necessarily see that. I mean, if in all of your talking that might come up, but, you know, what does that look like?
When I think back on Uzbekistan, I don't think of there are things that I wish the U.S. government had done. I often think there are things I wish that we had seen. That I drove by that protest and I saw those people lining, and I just thought, well, it's time to go to my project sites and to, you know, do all the things that I thought were important to do that day. But that impression is never lost on me, that it's so easy to lose the bigger picture and to just not bring that general level of critical thinking and inquisitiveness that's just so important. You know, it's now we think of all the awareness raising that we're trying to do, or trying to come up with tools or indicators or things for people to be thinking about in these contexts. And it's true, I often think that if we were considering what the Karimov regime was probably thinking in that context of colored revolutions months after their neighbor had been deposed in a revolution, I'm sure I probably would have thought of that context a little differently. I think the strengths of USAID's role in this atrocity prevention work stream that's related to the APB has really been this focus on, hey, you can do a lot more in the years before violence occurs than you can in the months or days. And development assistance might not be a very good tool in the weeks or months before violence, but it's a very good tool and an important one in those years before. I think back to Uzbekistan in 2005, and yes, it's an autocratic state, and yes, we probably should have predicted that Karimov would react the way he did, but I think of rule of law programs and the justice sector, and if only that judge hadn't come down with crazy show trial type sentences, maybe it's a different story in Uzbekistan. Maybe those people don't die, maybe something else changes the trajectory of the state. So I do think looking at those institutions that are such an important kind of part of the democracy, human rights and governance kind of perspective really do matter.
As a DIG officer, I think one of the most important things is to, and it's possible to do, is to set up and support if they don't exist already. If they exist, support them. If they don't, try to contribute to setting up sort of network systems that will allow the people in the country to be able to monitor what's happening. And I know that's something that you're all thinking about, and it may be, in certain contexts, something that can be done in concert with, even with the government in the country where you are. In other cases, clearly it's the government that's the problem. So I think that that's important, because without that, you can't really, you don't have much basis to do anything. But then once you have some information, I think people should just be encouraged to sort of follow the lead of Jim McGee and be, you know, not hesitate and not be afraid of being sort of activist in the sense, because if our being out in these countries has any sense at all, then contributing to preventing these kinds of atrocities is the minimum thing that we should be doing. I mean, if we're not doing that, I guess another way of saying it, then it makes very little sense to me that we be there for provision of health care or education or so on.